Hey there. In this video, I want to talk about documentation, both user documentation and developer documentation. You may be thinking, wow, what an exciting topic, documentation. Trust me, I know, but you need it in some cases. So, when do you need it and what type of documentation do you need? You'll find out in this video. Let's go. All right, I want to start talking about user documentation. This is the documentation that you'll direct your users to if they don't know how to use something. And I want to start by talking about some of the things that you may need documentation for, but maybe you shouldn't. And again, there's a caveat, a big asterisk here. So let's talk about it. First, why do you need user documentation? These are the 4 reasons: improved user experience, reduced support costs, compliance and legal protection. This one is important. And developer experience. This one also important if you have a developer experience for your customers. But let's start at the beginning and talk about the improved user experience. So if you have a product, let's say you just started your SaaS business, right? And you have maybe a developer, maybe 2, working on a product, and it's growing. You're adding features. It's starting to get complex. As you're building, you may be like, this flow is a little bit complicated. Maybe I should write some documentation for it. Great. That is a good time to start writing documentation. But one thing I'm going to tell you right off the bat is, in this day and age, people don't like reading. Straight up. I mean, when people say, oh yeah, I read a book, blah, 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 what they actually mean is they listened to it on Audible, right? So writing documentation isn't as good as it used to be. Let's just put it that way. Instead, your software should be as intuitive as possible, so that users don't have to be aren't confused when they're using your application, right? So you are reusing the same flows that people see on the internet, your modals and drop downs and multi-select, stuff like that. Things that people already know how to use because they use them elsewhere. You use them in your application. That's it. If you can make it intuitive, you don't need that much application or that much documentation. And the other thing too is, don't make it complicated, right? Don't make me think. It's a great book, by the way. Actually, let me grab that over here. Don't Make Me Think. Good book. So if you can have an intuitive experience, you're not going to need as much documentation. An example of that is getting started or introduction to the application, like how to get started. What are the main facets of the application? Yeah, you could probably write something about that, but just to have. Now, reduced support costs is something that you maybe okay. It's again controversial take here. But why is your software having issues to begin with? And I don't mean like there's an exception being thrown or an error or your server goes down. Like, those things should not be happening, period. Your software should be tested. See other video about testing. But where do customers get stuck, right? What are they having issues with? For example, you're exporting a Excel file from your data, and it's big and it's not very clear that it's exporting. That's something you may want to consider. Maybe improving the in-app experience or writing some documentation about this specific scenario I just mentioned about downloading. It's from if you look at Canva, for example, when you go to export, they have like a whole experience. You got like a drop down, and the drop down, you select checkboxes, you navigate, you click download, and then it pops up a thing at the bottom that actually says, downloading, preparing and downloading. So it's kind of neat. Anyways, just to sum this up, basically, if a user is confused about how to do something, or there's like a complicated flow that they don't know how to do, they may contact support like, hey, I thought I could export an Excel spreadsheet, but I don't know where to find it. You could have documentation for that. And now we're getting into the important thing, compliance and legal protection. So this is something that you should have not only in your documentation, but in some cases also in your application. So for instance, anywhere you're using open source software and it requires attribution, maybe it's not MIT, maybe it's GPL or whatever. And it's like, hey, you must write in your app that you're using this software. You need to have that written down somewhere. And that's not considered like part of documentation, but it is kind of documentation, right? So you should have this. Anything where you're saying any legal restrictions on the use of your software, right? So I have an example here where image conversion software should be used with legally obtained or licensed images only, right? So you're not like, I don't know where you'd get unlicensed images, but like, let's say you got an image somewhere of Google search, right? And then you use it in your application, or someone uses it in your application and they make a conversion and they're like, well, I used this app to convert it. And you need to have some kind of text in your app that's like, absolves you of any legal responsibility, basically, for the use of your software. So this is very important. You need to have this. And if you don't have a legal team helping you with this, you may want to think about at least hiring someone that knows what they're doing to write some legal copy for your application. All right, now, developer experience. So if your application is providing some kind of developer endpoints, an API of some sort, usually a REST API or whatnot. For example, let's say you have built some kind of a platform, some AI platform, and it's uniquely trained to do a certain thing, and you're having an API for it, right? So other people can write applications to connect to your application. You're going to need some developer docs because people aren't going to know about these endpoints, right, that you've created. So the better documentation you have for developers, the better your application is going to do. Now, I put here, and I know this from my own experience, as well as a developer, I love this. If you have clear developer documentation, again, if your application needs to have a developer experience, if you have clear documentation, your app will be very popular among developers. I mean, look at Stripe. Like, they started out as nobody, right? But their docs were phenomenal, and now they're like the biggest player in the game. So very important, very, very, very important to have a good developer experience. That usually comes with docs, and developers don't mind reading. I mean, some developers maybe do, but generally you're like, okay, the first thing I do when I go to some website, I'm like, where are the docs at? Where are the docs, right? So important to have those if you need them. Maybe you don't need them. All right, now that is user docs. So these are public-facing docs that users of your application will read. Let's talk about developer docs. It's a bit of a smaller section. Not because developers need less documentation, there's just less to talk about. So let's cover that. Now, I've been on teams where docs didn't exist, or they did and they were terrible, or they were outdated. And I've actually also been on teams where docs were amazing. I got up to speed within like a week of joining. So I've seen it all. And one thing I will say is that you must, at the very minimum, have onboarding documentation. If some new developer comes in, they need to know how to get started. And here's the reason why. Once you have that documentation written, you don't need to have other developers train the new developers. So you can just be like, here are the onboarding docs, go to town, where the developers that already exist on the team, they can continue building the application, adding features, adding value to the customer, right? And the onboarding docs take care of onboarding anyone new. I would say this is the absolute minimum of developer documentation that you must have. Now, on top of that, you will also want to comment your code. People always joke like, oh, your documentation sucks. Well, I commented my code. Yeah, it's not a joke. If your code is well commented, if it's sorted, if it's organized, right? Maybe you're in C# and you're using regions in Visual Studio, or basically you're using JS or you're using JSDoc throughout your application or something like that. Like at any point you're adding documentation to the code, it's great. Remember, when you're compiling your code, all the comments get stripped. All the regions are like, none of that exists, right? When you compile your code, especially like for release. So it doesn't matter. But for developers, it's really good to have a comment, because now they know what's happened, like what they're looking at, right? Without having to go and refer to like an documentation and some other application. It speeds up development. So commenting code is also really quite good, but onboarding, honestly, you just have it. If you're planning on having more than one developer on your team, have an onboarding doc. Okay, let's talk about knowledge preservation. So this is actually kind of an interesting topic. I'm dealing with this right now. Let's say your application is doing something complex. You've written an algorithm that transforms data in a certain way, maybe something to do with AI, maybe the way that you're training a model, or anything like that, any kind of proprietary knowledge that is difficult to find on Stack Overflow. If you know, you know. Anything like that should be written down in a knowledge base for your team. And we'll talk about the kind of software you can use for this, but knowledge preservation is important, because if somebody leaves, the knowledge leaves. But if the knowledge is written down, well, then you're still good, right? So it's critical to preserve knowledge that is proprietary to your application. So you should have this written down. Knowledge preservation, very important. Now, if it's something that's like, anybody can find on the internet just with a simple search, don't worry about it. But proprietary stuff, write it down. And lastly, consistency. When you're working with multiple developers, especially maybe in a larger organization, maybe like in a small SaaS business you just started, this may be not that big of a deal. But as you grow, different developers will come in with different styles, right? Somebody will, let's say it's JavaScript, somebody will put semicolons on the end of the line, and other people won't. Somebody will maybe put the bracket on the end of the function name. Somebody will put it under the function name. There's software, there are plugins that help with this. In C#, there's StyleCop. In JavaScript, there's Prettify. There are linters and stuff like that you can use for consistency across your code. But that is just code, right? How about the actual architectural implementation of something? Let's say you're using, Blazor. And Blazor comes with like an opinionated way to build your application, right? Everything's a component. Or hell, React, right? Everything is a function essentially, or a class, whatever function. So React is really quite opinionated, but let's say you want to do something a little bit different, right? Maybe you come in from a different framework and you're like, well, React is all cool and stuff, but I want to add a store like Redux or something. Well, somebody coming in later maybe has never worked with Redux. Maybe they just work with use state or something. Maybe they're a beginner. Anyway, the point is, what I'm trying to make is the architecture of your application and the way that you implement things across your application should also be documented. If you don't do this, if you do not document the architecture, people are going to roll in, new developers are going to roll in, they're going to implement things in their own way. Yeah, maybe things are going to work just fine, but once those people leave, they move on to different companies, you have this code base, and you hire new developers who come in, they're going to be confused as hell. They're going to be like, wait, here we're doing this, but here's kind of the same thing, but it's done differently, and here's like yet another. It's just this is kind of like a long-term investment. So code consistency is one thing, architectural consistency is another thing. You should have both. And this is great to document on an internal wiki somewhere. So anybody that's onboarding, anybody new, they can go read that and be like, oh, okay, so here we're using MVVM, or here we're using the MVC pattern, or whatever. It's just something like that, right? Or microservices should be done in a certain way, and they should all have this logger injected in here and there, right? So those are the kinds of things you need to write down. You should write down. Otherwise, it's gonna be confusing for anybody new joining in, and then any maintenance that has to happen after the application has been alive for a while. All right, so now that we've talked about this, let's talk about some tooling. There are so many tools that you can use to write your documentation, and there's just not enough space on this canvas to draw all of them. So I've given some examples of what you can do. Now, in a previous video, CI/CD, I talked about using GitHub. GitHub also has a wiki. It's kind of primitive, okay? It's pretty basic. But if your application is not very complicated, if all you're doing is just writing some onboarding, you can use the GitHub wiki. Maybe knowledge preservation, use the GitHub wiki. I think anything internal, you can use the GitHub wiki. And honestly, if you're storing your code on GitHub, just have the wiki right there. It's right there, right? So this goes well with GitHub. So I would just use this if you're using GitHub to store your code. But let's say you're using GitHub to store your code, but you're using DevOps to deploy, or you're using Azure DevOps for project management. They also have a wiki there. And of course, if you're using Jira by Confluence, they also have a wiki. So you can use that as well. Comment your code. We already talked about this. Developers writing the code shouldn't just like write a complex function and move on to the next one. They should comment what the function does. What is its purpose? Why is it there? Why is it why is it written the way it's written? Potentially, if you have an O of n squared, you might want to write down why it's like that, because somebody might roll in and be like, wait a second, O of n squared, I learned in school it's not bad, or that it's bad to have that. Well, maybe there's a comment there. Maybe the data that it's doing the looping on is not that bad or something. So commenting your code, important as well. Notion, very popular, right? You probably have seen this on YouTube. Lots of people use Notion for all kinds of things. For development, I wouldn't use that necessarily for development, but it's doable. One other thing that I want to talk about is source code gen here. If you comment your code and you put for example, JS doc on top of your functions, you can generate documentation from those comments. The reason why I put it in red here is because it's not going to be very good. It's better than nothing, for sure, especially for when we were talking about developer experience up here. You're going to want to have some kind of a source code gen. Usually it's a Swagger or something like that, where people can just come in and immediately test, quote unquote, your API using Swagger. So it's good to have for certain things, but it's really only relevant for this one experience over here, the developer experience. And other than that, it's not very useful. So if you don't have a developer experience, you don't need to even worry about this. Other options, SharePoint, you could use it. It's kind of clunky and slow and expensive, but you could. OneNote, I did put it in red here, but honestly, I use OneNote for everything. I use OneNote for this channel. I use it at work. It's just really good. I use it for my life. I have my recipes in there, cooking recipes. So it's a really good application, but I just don't think it's really that good for working on a team. Okay, last I want to touch on, so all of these options here are good for developer docs. Okay, developer documentation. GitHub Wiki, actually, you can also use for customer documentation. I wouldn't, because you don't want to send customers to like source control, even if it's hidden from them. It's a little odd, right? But there are other good options for user documentation. So these are called generators, and you write your documentation using Markdown, and then which is just essentially text with some special syntax to make things bold or italic or a list or a table or larger font size, stuff like that. You write it using Markdown, and then you generate static documentation from it. The reason why this is good is because it has amazing SEO. Well, usually, I mean, I don't know if all of these do, but VitePress I know is actually pretty good. Docusaurus, actually another really good one. I used that one before. VitePress and Docusaurus. I haven't used the other ones, but these are just some options here. And what they do is they take your Markdown and they turn that Markdown, those MD files, they turn them into really good looking themed documentation. And because it has good SEO, you can add it to Google or Bing or some other cool search engines, and they will be indexed there. So then when someone is looking for something like how to ABC on application XYZ, your documentation will come up in Google search, right? Because it's a very specific query about your application, and you have good SEO on your docs, so it'll come up as one of the first results. So this is really good to have. Not good to have. I mean, it's required. If you have any kind of user docs, you're gonna need probably to use one of these. Now, you could also host your documentation on managed documentation providers, but they're not going to be cheap. And all of these other ones that you write yourself and then you generate and then you host, free, 100%. Just like this video, free. These are just some options for tooling. Again, I know, not a sexy topic, documentation, but it is required for your product to be successful. So let's do a quick recap. User documentation, right? This is for your customers. Improved user experience, reduced support costs. You should have at least a little bit of something there, especially for kind of getting started, introduction to the application. But optimally, your application would be very intuitive and easy to use, and therefore this documentation would be moot But if it's not, maybe have it there. Compliance and legal, you need it. So just have it. If you're using any kind of open source software, you should have it listed in there if it requires attribution. Developer experience. If you have anything developer facing, you must have documentation. Simple. Now, for developer documentation, this is internal, so your customers won't be seeing this. For onboarding, you should have it if you're planning on growing your team. Knowledge preservation, you should have it, period. Unless you're building something, stupid simple that doesn't require doesn't have any proprietary knowledge. Okay, well, maybe you don't need it then. But most of the time, if you're building a software application, you're gonna have some edge, right, that you're gonna be selling, and you want to document what that edge is. So anybody coming in, any new developers will be like, oh, okay, so this is how that works, right? Document it. And then consistency. This is also really important if you're growing your team. New developers coming in, maybe like, well, I don't know what I'm looking at here. It's done in a different way over here and over here and over there. So having some kind of documentation that says, hey, this is how our application is built. This is the overall architecture, and this is how you should be implementing things going forward. Also quite important, and I would also have it here in developer documentation. It doesn't need to be big, right? It doesn't need to be huge, not like an essay, but just have some stuff, right? Anything that you're building, just write it down. And then here are the tools that you can use. So comment your code. Honestly, if you're hosting on GitHub, just use the wiki there. It's good. And then for anything else, now for developer documentation, developer experience up here, you must have some kind of docs for that. The easiest way to accomplish this is by using a source code generator. So just learn how to use that. Probably use Swagger for an API or something like that. And then for user documentation, you can use any of these options. There are also other ones. Basically, you write down some markdown and you generate documentation out of that markdown, and then you host it somewhere for free. All right, so that's all I got for you in this video. I hope it was useful. In the next and final video in the series, we're going to talk about project management. So I'll see you there. Take care.